In the early 1960s, the Air Force had decided that dogfighting was over. The logic seemed reasonable at the time. New radar systems could track targets from miles away. Missiles could destroy an aircraft before the pilot ever saw it coming. Close-range turning combat, the kind that had defined aerial warfare from the First World War through Korea, was finished. The next generation of jets were built to reflect that belief. Large, fast, loaded with electronics. Some carried no gun at all because guns, the thinking went, belonged to a previous era. Vietnam proved that wrong in a way that was hard to dismiss. American pilots kept encountering Soviet-built MiGs at close range, in exactly the kind of turning fights that were supposed to be obsolete. In Korea, American pilots had achieved a kill ratio of roughly 10-1. In Vietnam, that figure fell to somewhere between 2 and 3-1, varying by period and source. The jets were more sophisticated. The missiles were more capable. Pilots were dying anyway. What strikes me about that period is not the tactical failure. It is that the Air Force had essentially told its pilots that a certain kind of danger no longer existed, and then sent them somewhere that danger was everywhere. A colonel named John Boyd had been watching all of this with controlled fury. Boyd had flown F-16 Sabres in Korea and later became an instructor at the fighter weapons school at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. He kept an open challenge for any pilot on the base. Start from a position of tactical disadvantage in a simulated dogfight, and Boyd would have them beaten inside 40 seconds, hundreds of times, never lost once. The other pilots called him 40-second Boyd, which was not entirely a compliment. Together with a mathematician named Thomas Christie, Boyd developed what became known as energy maneuverability theory. Survival in a turning fight depended on how efficiently an aircraft could gain and shed energy during a maneuver. A jet that bled too much speed in a hard turn could not recover position. Simple as that, and somehow it had taken a war to make the point. The aircraft that came from that thinking was the F-16. What separated it from everything before, it had almost nothing to do with raw speed. It came down to what they did with the cockpit. Boyd and the group around him, known informally as the Fighter Mafia, treated the cockpit not as a workspace, but as a problem. Every angle, every control position, every surface was examined against one question: in what specific ways are pilots dying, and what can be changed? The seat was tilted back at 30 degrees. At high G-forces, the heart has to push blood upward against the force pressing the pilot into the seat. A reclined position shortens that distance by seconds. In that environment, seconds are the difference between a decision and the absence of one. The control stick moved from the center floor to the right side of the seat. Rather than mechanical cables, it sent electrical signals to the flight surfaces. A pilot pulling 9 Gs, whose arm now carries close to 10 times its normal weight, could still manage the aircraft with fingertip pressure. I think about that detail more than most. The idea that at the edge of human physiological tolerance, the solution was to make the controls lighter, not stronger. Weapon selection, radar functions, and countermeasure controls were all relocated to the throttle and the stick. Hands on throttle and stick, the system known as HOTAS, meant the pilot never had to drop their eyes to the instrument panel during a fight. Attention stays outside, where the threats are. The canopy was redesigned as a single unframed bubble with no crossbars cutting through the pilot's field of view. Visibility extended close to 360 degrees. Flight data and targeting information were projected at eye level directly onto the inside of that canopy through the head-up display, readable without the pilot lowering their head even slightly. Each of these changes came from studying a particular way a pilot had died. Not a category of failure, a specific death. A canopy frame that cost a fraction of a second of visibility. An instrument scan that pulled attention at the wrong moment. A G-force that drained blood from the brain mid-maneuver and left someone quietly, suddenly not there anymore, still strapped into a jet doing 600 miles an hour. The F-16 was built on an uncomfortable premise. The aircraft itself is a hostile environment. Everything in the design was an attempt to manage that fact, not eliminate it, manage it. An international student pilot is flying over the American Southwest. Training exercise. His instructor is nearby in a separate jet. The student rolls and begins pulling back on the stick, and at around 8.3 Gs, he is simply gone. Not ejected, not dead, unconscious in the seat while the Falcon continues in full afterburner, nose dropping, rolling toward the ground from 17,000 feet. 22 seconds pass. The instructor calls for recovery, no response. The jet is now nose down nearly 50 degrees below the horizon, going supersonic, falling through 11,000 feet. What saves the pilot is not training or instinct. It is a computer system called the Automatic Ground Collision Avoidance System, which detects the trajectory, takes control, and pulls the aircraft out. The pilot wakes up mid-recovery, briefly fights the system without knowing it, and lands. He has no memory of any of it. That footage is unclassified. It exists. And the first time I watched it, what struck me was not the near miss. It was how fast it happened. 8.3 Gs, and a trained military pilot was simply out. So what is actually happening inside the body when that occurs? The heart pumps blood upward to the brain against gravity. Under normal conditions, this requires no effort worth mentioning. Pull hard in a fighter jet, and the G-force pressing the pilot into the seat begins working directly against that flow. At 2 to 3 Gs, the edges of the visual field go gray. Pilots call it the gray veil. Push further, 4 to 5 Gs, and vision goes entirely. The pilot is conscious, but blind. Above 6 Gs, the brain exhausts its reserve of oxygenated blood. That reserve lasts 3 to 5 seconds, regardless of fitness level, regardless of experience. After that, the lights go out. At 9 Gs, an 80-kilogram pilot is carrying the equivalent of 720 kilograms. Breathing becomes a deliberate act. The face changes shape under the load. The technique developed to fight this is called the anti-G straining maneuver, refined across decades from methods first tested during the Second World War. The pilot tenses the large muscle groups of the legs, abdomen, and lower body while cycling through a specific breathing pattern. Sharp inhalation followed by exhalation against a closed airway, repeated every 2.5 to 3 seconds. Done correctly and without interruption, it raises blood pressure in the upper body enough to keep the brain supplied. Let it slip for a few seconds during a sustained high G maneuver, and the sequence starts again, whether the pilot notices or not. The G-suit inflates automatically around the legs and abdomen, squeezing blood back toward the upper body. It adds roughly 1 G of additional tolerance, which helps, though at 9 Gs sustained, 1 G is not a solution. It is a small extension of the margin before the margin runs out. What made the Falcon particularly unforgiving on this point was that it could hold 9 Gs continuously. Previous jets hit high G forces and bled speed. They could not sustain it. The Falcon could, which meant pilots were now spending far longer inside the physiological danger zone than any previous aircraft had required of them. The training had not kept pace with what the machine could do. The Air Force eventually accepted that gap and built around it. The Auto-G CAS system, the same one that caught the student pilot over the Southwest, was installed across the fleet after a pattern of accidents that resisted other explanations. Jets in perfect mechanical condition, experienced pilots, no obvious cause. Just a maneuver held slightly too long, and then silence on the radio. There is something genuinely uncomfortable in that engineering decision, if you think about it for a moment. The Air Force built a jet that routinely exceeded what a human pilot could physically tolerate, and then spent years developing systems to catch the pilot when that happened. The machine was always going to win that contest. The only open question was what came next. In combat, nothing catches what comes from outside the aircraft. There is a sound inside the cockpit that every F-16 pilot knows and nobody gets used to. The radar warning receiver does not beep politely. It screams. A specific tone for a specific threat, shifting as a missile transitions from search mode to track mode to active guidance. Pilots train with it for hundreds of hours. They learn to parse those tones the way a musician hears individual instruments in an orchestra. In a training environment, the sound means stop and debrief. In combat, it means something is already airborne and closing. The first response is chaff and flares. Chaff ejects a cloud of metallic strips to confuse radar-guided missiles. Flares burn hot enough to pull heat-seeking missiles away from the engine. Deploy both, maneuver hard, and hope the missile loses the thread. If that fails, the backup is geometry. A radar-guided missile homes using proportional navigation, constantly adjusting to keep the target in its seeker. The weakness is angular. Pull hard enough, fast enough, at the right moment, and the missile overshoots. The trained response was to go perpendicular to the missile's approach around 4 seconds before estimated impact. 4 seconds is not a long time when the radar warning receiver is still screaming and the radio is full of other people's emergencies. January 19th, 1991. Baghdad. 72 F-16 jets from 2 tactical fighter wings, targeting the Tuwaitha Nuclear Research Center and sites across downtown Baghdad. The Iraqi air defense network around the city included over 16,000 surface-to-air missiles in country, with radar systems ranging from aging Soviet equipment to more capable SA-6 batteries. The defense suppression aircraft assigned to clear the way did not all reach their targets. Fuel, timing, command decisions. The jets going into downtown flew into an alerted and largely intact network. Major Emmett Tulia, callsign Stroke 3, received his first missile warning shortly after rolling in on target. Deployed chaff, pulled hard, the missile missed. He dropped his bombs on the oil refinery and turned south. 3 more missiles launched simultaneously. He defeated them. Then an SA-6 locked on and closed to within a distance where Tulia later said he could physically hear the rocket motor past the cockpit. He pulled everything the aircraft had. The missile went wide. What he did not know was that his chaff dispensers had been malfunctioning since the start of the engagement. Every brake turn he flew without any countermeasures at all. 6 missiles, no chaff, no flares, just the geometry of the brakes and whatever margin existed between his timing and the missile's guidance system. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross after landing. 2 of his wingmen were not as fortunate. Captain Mike Roberts and Major Jeffrey Tice were both hit, both ejected, and both were held as prisoners of war until March 1991. The radio recording from that day captures the moment Roberts was struck. The call comes in flat and fast, the way pilots are trained to speak when time has stopped being a luxury. What I keep returning to is the chaff malfunction. Tulia flew one of the more extraordinary pieces of airmanship in the history of the aircraft, and he did it without knowing that the system designed to make his survival more likely was not functioning. No cockpit indication, no warning, just the receiver, the geometry, and the brakes. The aircraft does not always tell you what it is not giving you. Nobody thinks about the ejection seat until they have to. It sits there through every pre-flight, every mission, every landing. 127 pounds of aluminum, explosives, and sequenced machinery built to function under conditions where everything else has already stopped functioning. Most pilots will never pull the handle. The ones who do tend to remember very little of what follows. From the moment the handle is pulled, the sequence takes under 4 seconds. The canopy goes first, blown clear by explosive charges. The rocket catapult fires, driving the seat up the rails at a peak acceleration of around 12 Gs. A gyroscope spinning at 10,500 revolutions per minute stabilizes the seat's attitude as it clears the aircraft. The rocket motor underneath burns to carry the pilot clear of the tail, and a drogue chute pulls the main parachute out. 10 minutes of emergency oxygen starts automatically, triggered by a lanyard attached to the cockpit floor the moment the seat began moving. The system is called the ACES-2. It operates across 3 modes depending on altitude and airspeed, adjusting the sequence to give the pilot the best available outcome in whatever condition the aircraft happens to be in when the handle is pulled. The overall survival rate across more than 460 recorded ejections as of the late 1990s was above 90%. Which sounds reassuring until you think about what 90% means for the other 10. June 2nd, 1995, Bosnia. Captain Scott O'Grady was one of 2 F-16 pilots on a routine patrol enforcing the NATO no-fly zone. Near the town of Mirkonjic Grad, a Bosnian Serb unit had positioned a mobile SA-6 battery, moved it recently, and had been switching the radar on intermittently to avoid detection. They waited until O'Grady's jet was directly overhead, the position where the aircraft's warning geometry is weakest, before firing 2 missiles. The first exploded between the 2 jets, the second struck O'Grady. His flight lead watched the aircraft break apart and saw no parachute. He assumed O'Grady was dead. O'Grady had reached between his knees and pulled the handle. He came down in Serb-controlled territory with a 29-pound survival pack and the immediate knowledge that the people below him were already looking. He hid for 6 days, moving at night, eating insects, wringing rainwater from his socks, staying off roads and away from any sound that suggested a search. On the 6th day, he made radio contact. United States Marines flew in under fire to extract him. 3 shoulder-launched missiles fired at the helicopters during the approach, all missing. He walked out. What the seat delivered him into was not safety. It was a different set of problems, ones no piece of equipment could fully solve. The ACES-2 gets a pilot clear of a destroyed aircraft. What happens in the 30 seconds after that is beyond its engineering. The pilots flying over Ukraine right now understand this in a way that is not theoretical. Everything in the previous 4 chapters happened in the past. The Gulf War, Bosnia, training accidents over the Nevada desert, history that has been processed, documented, and filed away. This chapter is not history. Ukraine received its first F-16 jets in the summer of 2024, donated by European allies after years of lobbying from Kyiv. The aircraft were more capable than anything the Ukrainian Air Force had been flying, Soviet-era jets maintained on dwindling spare parts. The F-16 was supposed to change the calculus. It did, though not always in the ways anyone anticipated. The first loss came within weeks. August 26, 2024. Lieutenant Colonel Oleksiy Mez, callsign Moonfish, was scrambled to intercept a large-scale Russian missile and drone attack, the kind of mass saturation strike designed to overwhelm air defenses by volume alone. He shot down 3 cruise missiles and a drone, then his jet went down. The official cause was not immediately established. What emerged over the following months, through reporting by the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, was a theory that has never been confirmed, but has not been dismissed either. The Ukrainian Patriot air defense batteries defending the same airspace that night were operating without the Link 16 tactical data network, a secure communication system that allows air defense units to identify friendly aircraft in real time. Without it, a Patriot battery and an F-16 operating in the same airspace at night, at low altitude, during a saturation attack, are working from incomplete pictures of who else is up there. Mez had saved the people below him. Whether his own side's systems contributed to his death remains an open question. That detail sits with me more than almost anything else in this film. April 12, 2025, Captain Pavlo Ivanov, 26 years old, killed in the northeastern Sumy region, most likely by a Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile according to Russian sources, though Ukrainian officials have not confirmed the specific cause. He had previously flown Soviet-era ground attack jets before transitioning to the F-16 and had been flying the aircraft for less than a year. President Zelensky awarded him the title of Hero of Ukraine, posthumously. June 29, 2025, Lieutenant Colonel Maxim Ustimenko intercepted a Russian attack and shot down 7 targets. The 7th damaged his jet. With the aircraft losing altitude, Ustimenko steered it away from the residential area below him before it went down. He did not eject. 3 weeks earlier, a 4th pilot had lost contact with his aircraft during a nighttime intercept at around 3:30 in the morning. He had destroyed 3 targets and was engaging a 4th with his cannon when an unspecified emergency occurred. He steered away from populated areas and jumped. Search and rescue teams reached him quickly. He survived. The difference between Package Q in 1991 and a Ukrainian intercept mission in 2025 is not the physics. It is that Ukraine has roughly 16 operational jets, a pilot pool that cannot be quickly replaced, and no margin for attrition. Moonfish, Ivanov, Ustimenko, a 4th pilot whose name has not been released. I find it difficult to write about those details in any kind of detached way. The F-16 was built to solve a problem, not range, not payload, not stealth, the problem of the human being sitting inside it. Every design decision in this film, the reclined seat, the side-mounted stick, the unframed canopy, was an engineering answer to a specific way that pilots were dying. The aircraft was, in a sense, a 50-year argument that if you understood precisely how a human body fails under combat conditions, you could build something that compensated for each failure. That argument has held up well. It has also never fully worked. The Auto-G-CAS catches pilots who lose consciousness, but only when the threat is the ground. The ACES-2 delivers a pilot out of a destroyed aircraft and into whatever is waiting below. The G-suit and the AGSM extend the margin before physiological failure without eliminating the failure point. The pilot remains a biological organism operating at the outer edge of what biology can sustain, inside a machine that routinely exceeds those limits. The Air Force has known this for a long time. The response, increasingly, is to ask whether the pilot needs to be there at all. Unmanned loyal wingmen have been under serious development for several years. Smaller, cheaper, uncrewed aircraft flying alongside a manned fighter, controlled autonomously or by the lead pilot, carrying weapons, drawing fire, performing tasks that would otherwise require putting another human being in another cockpit in the same airspace. The United States Air Force has tested the XQ-58A Valkyrie in this role. Australia has developed the MQ-28 Ghost Bat under a similar concept. Nobody has a clean answer yet on how much of what a combat pilot does can be handed to an algorithm. What I find interesting is where the resistance comes from. Not primarily from pilots worried about their careers, though that exists. It comes from the people who study what actually happens in the seconds between a radar warning and a missile impact. The judgment calls about whether to abort or press through. The moment Ustimenko chose to steer away from the houses rather than eject while he still could. These are not decisions that map onto a decision tree. They involve something genuinely difficult to define and more difficult to replicate. Whether that something can eventually be encoded is the question the next generation of combat aircraft will have to answer. The pilots over Ukraine are not waiting for that answer. They are flying anyway, in aircraft built around their limitations, making decisions in fractions of seconds that determine whether the missile hits the jet or the neighborhood below it. Most of the time, it holds. Not always. The mission ends, the jet lands, the pilot climbs out. Then what? There is a debrief, a review of the HUD footage, the radio calls, the decisions made at speed. Someone checks the fuel numbers. A form gets filled out, and then the pilot walks back to wherever pilots go between missions, which in a combat deployment is usually a small room with a cot, a laptop, and the particular silence of a base that never fully quiets down. Military aviation has studied pilot psychology for decades, partly because the cost of losing a trained fighter pilot is high enough that understanding what breaks them has genuine strategic value. What the research consistently found was not what most people expect. The acute stress of combat, the incoming missiles, the radar warnings, the brake turns at the edge of what the body can sustain, is not what tends to accumulate into something damaging. Pilots are selected and trained specifically to function under that kind of pressure. The screening process is designed to eliminate people who cannot. What accumulates is something quieter. It is the pattern recognition. A pilot who has flown enough combat missions starts to understand, in a very personal way, that the statistics are not abstract. Roberts and Tice did not come home from Package Q. Moonfish did not come home from an intercept that looked, on paper, like dozens of missions he had already flown. Ustimenko flew his last sortie in an aircraft that was functioning correctly when he took off. At some point, a pilot stops being able to pretend that experience and skill are sufficient insulation against what the numbers actually say. There is no point in the training where anyone teaches a pilot how to hold that knowledge and keep flying anyway. The assumption is that they will find a way. Most do. Some rely on the rhythm of the work itself, the pre-flight checks, the systems reviews, the familiar sequence that does not change regardless of what the last mission produced. Others develop a practiced ability to treat each flight as isolated, unconnected to the one before it or the one that will follow. What the culture does not particularly reward is talking about any of this openly, which means most of what pilots actually do to manage it stays invisible. What I find striking, reading accounts across different conflicts, is how consistent the language is. Pilots tend not to describe what they do as courage. They describe it as a job, a set of tasks with a defined sequence. You check the aircraft, you fly the mission, you come back, you debrief, then you do it again. That framing is not denial. The pilots who struggle most are often the ones who try to find meaning in each individual mission, who look for a narrative arc in what is largely a repetitive and statistically managed form of controlled risk. The ones who last tend to treat it the way a surgeon treats a difficult procedure: present, precise, then done. The Ukrainian pilots flying intercept missions right now do not have that kind of distance available to them. They are flying over their own country. The residential areas they steer away from when their aircraft are hit are neighborhoods they know. The cruise missiles they intercept are aimed at cities where their families live. The compartmentalization that other pilots describe as a professional tool becomes, under those conditions, something more complicated and harder to maintain. One Ukrainian pilot, interviewed anonymously in early 2025, was asked how he manages the weight of near-daily combat operations. He said he thinks about the landing, not the mission. Not what is coming toward the aircraft. Just the moment the wheels touch the runway and the jet slows and he is back on the ground. He flies toward that moment. It is not a complicated answer. It might be the only one that works. I started this film with a sound. A rocket motor passing close enough to a cockpit that the pilot could hear it over everything else. That detail has stayed with me through every chapter. Every piece of research, every account I read of what it actually means to sit inside one of these aircraft when the situation outside is trying to end your life. What I kept coming back to was not the danger. It was the gap between what we think we know about fighter pilots and what the reality looks like up close. The engineering that goes into a single F-16, from the reclined seat angle to the fly-by-wire controls to the ejection seat sequencing, represents decades of specific answers to specific failures. The people who designed those systems were not romantics. They were engineers who studied the ways pilots were dying and built solutions to each one, and they were very good at it. And yet the pilot remains the most fragile component in the system, not because the engineering failed, but because the engineering was always compensating for something that cannot be fully engineered away: a biological organism with a 3 to 5 second oxygen reserve in its brain, a cardiovascular system that struggles above 6 Gs, a mind that was built for a world where threats move at the speed of a thrown spear rather than a radar-guided missile. The aircraft gave pilots more time, more margin before the options ran out. In the cases this film looked at, the difference between coming home and not coming home was often measured in seconds. Tullia's brake turns buying enough distance from 6 missiles to land and walk away, without countermeasures he did not know had failed. O'Grady's hand finding the ejection handle in the seconds after his jet broke apart. The pilot, in May 2025, keeping control of a damaged aircraft long enough to steer it away from houses before he jumped. Seconds. That is what the margin looks like in practice. The Ukrainian pilot who said he flies toward the landing struck me as one of the most honest things anyone said in the course of making this film. Not because it is heroic, but because it is not. It is a person doing a job that requires them to partition off everything except the next task, and the next, until the task is done, and they are still alive. Boyd's Fighter Mafia built a machine that could extend the window in which that kind of focus stays possible. The ACES-2 was built to catch the moment when it ran out. The Auto GCAS for the moment when even the seat came too late. Layer after layer of engineering, each one a response to the previous layer failing in some specific and documented way. None of it changes the fundamental situation. A person, inside a machine, inside a hostile sky. The machine is as good as anyone has managed to build. The sky does not care. Moonfish knew this. Ustimenko knew this. Every pilot who has ever taxied toward a runway with a live threat environment on the other side of it has known this, in the particular way that knowledge settles into the body rather than just the mind. They flew anyway. Not because they stopped being afraid, or because the training removed the risk, or because the aircraft made them feel invincible. Because the decision had been made, deliberately and without ceremony, and the pre-flight was done, and the runway was there, and the jet was ready. The cockpit asks the same things of the person sitting in it every single time. Stay conscious, stay oriented, make the right call in the next 4 seconds. Most of the time, they do.